So welcome. On behalf of Plough Quarterly magazine, welcome to the 2021 Rhina Espaillat Poetry Award ceremony. I'm Peter Momsen, the editor of Plough. And thank you that so many of you are joining us for this online gathering of celebration of poetry and of this award. Thank you especially to each of you poets who are with us who participated in this contest. It was a great pleasure for me and my fellow editors to read so many of the poems submitted. So this evening, we will announce the winner and the two finalists of the award. And we have the great honor to be joined by Rhina Espaillat herself, the poet after whom this award is named and whose spirit we conducted the contest. Before we get to that, of course, I'm the editor of Plough, so I have to give a shameless plug to our magazine. We have a new issue of the magazine, which I'm holding up here. It is the one that we just sent to the printer on Friday. And if you subscribe now, you will get the issue with the 3 winning poems in it, as well as a bunch of other wonderful content. It's called Beyond Borders is the theme of the issue. So if you go to plough.com, that's plough.com, you can do just that. You can subscribe. So without further ado, I will introduce Plough's poetry editor, A.M. Juster. He is a poet and poetry translator himself. He's written many books. Most recently, his book of poems, Wonder and Wrath, came out, I believe, last September. He's also, as I mentioned, translated a great deal. He's won the Howard Nemerov Sonnet Award 3 times, the Richard Wilbur Award, the Willis Barnstone Translation Prize, and many other awards. He's currently working on a translation of Petrarch's complete Canzoniere, and can't wait to see that coming out in 2023. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce A.M. Juster. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Well, first of all, let me make a shameless plug myself and thank my bosses, Peter and Sam Hine, for working so well to set up this event for the first time. And some of you may not realize this is the first time that we're doing this event. First time we've done this competition. And I've just been very impressed by the way Plough has handled this. And this award ceremony, this award is a little different than some of the others. And I think poets should be happy about it. Not a single dollar of the very reasonable entry fee went to submittable. None of it went to the judge or the judges. I did the initial screening, and then the editorial board actually selected the winners. And I was just blown away with the fact that almost everybody participated and everybody read the poems extremely carefully. And there was a very intense but civil discussion about who the winners should be. And I think it really speaks to the journal and to what this award is going to mean over time, that this is the way that Plough has decided to do it, which is fundamentally different from the way that it's done in almost every other journal that I'm aware of. Having made my shameless plug, it is my great privilege to introduce the namesake for the award to my left, Rhina P. Espaillat, who has been publishing poetry for about 75 years now. Originally involuntarily, one of her high school English teachers surreptitiously took some of her poetry and got it published in a major magazine when you were 15, 16? 16. And has continued to this day with 17 books to her name. She's also a translator that goes both ways. So she is the most distinguished translator into Spanish of 2 of our greatest poets, Robert Frost and Richard Wilbur. She also has translated many of the underappreciated Spanish poets into English. Particularly, I love her poems of Sor Juana, these wonderful, intricate religious poems that just are perfect for Rhina's meticulous attention to form and detail. They're just wonderful, wonderful translations. She's also been an inspiration for many, many poets, first with a an important group that she established in New York City. And then when she realized how much nicer it was to be here in Massachusetts, basically co-founded the Powwow River Poets, who've been one of the more successful groups, particularly in the area of formal poetry. So she is an institution here in Newburyport, in the United States as a whole and internationally, is revered, particularly in the Dominican Republic, where she came with her family as a political refugee when she was a young child. She fits the Plough mission so perfectly in that her poems focus almost all the time on a lot of the seemingly mundane details of the world, and yet she weaves this picture of them where all of a sudden you start seeing the bigger picture and the more spiritual significance of what's being witnessed. And somebody with a real international feel too, and an understanding of where people have been coming from and why certain things are important to them and that kind of thing. So it's a wonderful match for the mission of Plough. So with that, I'm going to announce and start introducing winners. One of the other things that we did that was a little different is we knew that it's often a very close call on the top, and it was a very close call among not only these three poets, but other poets as well. I mean, it was a very animated conversation. And it's a great credit to these three poets that they were picked over some marvelous poems by some poets that are really probably more famous than these three. But they did a great job. And we are glad that we'd be able to award significant prizes to the two runner-up as well as to the winner, which is a little unusual as well. So our first poet is Forrest Mcclatchy, who is a poet and critic from Atlanta. He teaches at Atlanta Classical Academy. And his poetry has appeared in Oxford Poetry, the Hopkins Review, Pleiades, Slice, and the Birmingham Poetry Review, among other journals. He won the 2019 Gulfstream Summer Poetry Competition and was a 2017 finalist in the American Literary Review competition. And his poem is a sonnet, Wreath Making. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Forrester to read the poem, and then I'll ask Rhina to just make a few comments at the end of that, and then we'll move to the other runner-up poem, and we'll do it all over again, and then we'll do it with our winner. So Forrester, why don't you take it away?
Oh, thank you, and thanks to everyone who helped put this on. The only thing I would like to say about my poem is that it's the only one I can remember writing in real time. I came out onto a porch where my wife was making a wreath, and it was a very messy process. There were sort of tree corpses strewn all over the porch, and I sat down and started to write, and it was kind of like the wreath and the poem were racing to be born, and the wreath won. But this is Wreath Making. The hard, dark berries, blue as black snakes are blue, befogged with newness, clench their pips in scaly tufts of green. Each branch an alencus of logic, a spray of craze, an attack on soft fingers walking through them, your fingers, calling shape from the bedlam of life with brutal twists of form. You flick the knife to smooth a stem, a cedar stem. Its fur heaps greenly on your shoes, as if you'd skinned a woolly tree, not trimmed it, to make a wreath. Completed circle, made of endings, shaped to hint what never ends. It tricks and bends the eye to green forevers, clever deaths of death, where girls and berries do escape.
Yeah. Rhina, what would you like to add?
I love this poem, first of all, for its imagery, because everything that he mentions as an important detail in this poem runs before my inside eye, my inner vision, like a film. I can see the dark berries, which reminds me of the dark berries in Richard Wilbur's poems for Amelia. And it has that same connotation of beauty, but with a little danger attached, the possibility of trouble. And then it has the spray of craze. I had to look up elenchus because I had never seen the word. And I love learning when I read poetry. I just love it when the poet gives me a gift, not only of music with language, but of a new word. And then we think of as part of beauty is also part of the pain of the work. And it is brutal. It can be brutal if it's used too tightly or used the way it should not be used, to clip, to cut, to inhibit. The skinned woolly tree made me think of the tree as a kind of animal, something alive that can feel hurt, which of course is also an attack on the reader. And this poem is one of those that attacks the reader, which is perfectly fine, perfectly right thing to do. And then it's shaped to hint what never ends. Well, of course, what never ends is life. One life may end, but life itself does not end, it continues. So here, right in the very first line of the last stanza, we have the hope that this poem was supposed to bring to the reader. The hint that never ends, and that tricks and bends the eye to green forevers, clever deaths of death. And there we have a reminder of John Donne's sonnet, Death Be Not Proud. And then girls and berries do occasionally escape, and they do, not always. We can't count on the good, but we should hope for it and remember that it exists. It's a lovely poem. It's a poem that tells the truth without exaggerating. And it's also beautiful, which is something that's often set against form, against the visual aspects of a poem. But this one has both. It has the visual and it has the music. So thank you very much.
And I would just make two notes. I focus a lot on my Twitter site and elsewhere on the craft of poetry. And there were a couple things in this poem that stood out for me in terms of the craft. The first is, and this is true whether it's formal poetry or free verse, I read an awful lot of poems where the poet had things that he or she desperately wanted to say, was having trouble saying it, and the response was to start layering an awful lot of fairly straightforward modifiers on the verbs and nouns. And that really doesn't work terribly well. It's trying too hard. And one of the things that is magnificent about this poem is it's very sparing in its modifiers, and it lets the very carefully chosen verbs and nouns speak for themselves. And so I like that a lot. In terms of another formal technique, which a lot of the great poets have used, I try to steal once in a while, is to try to intensify the rhyme towards the end. And sometimes people will write a poem in blank verse and end with a couplet, which is often very effective in that type of thing. What Forrester did here is a little bit more subtle, but in the same vein, in that he's got internal rhymes in the last tercet. So he's got, in addition to the end rhyme, he's got ends and bends in line 12. He has forevers and clever in line 13. And it really does help as he's getting to sort of the emotional high point of the poem, gives it that little extra intensity that maybe you don't even notice when you're listening to it, but somehow you notice it's gotten intense. And this is one of the things that Forrester, I think, did to give it that kind of beauty. So thank you, Forrester. It's a wonderful poem. Thank you for submitting. Okay, so now we will move to Susan DeSola and her poem, The Hunger Winter, 1944 to 1945, in parens, the Netherlands, which I would also just mention to people is where she is living now.
Yes, hi. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction because the subject of my poem is somewhat less well known. I am Susan de Sola, and I'm delighted to be part of this first Poetry Award for Rhina Espaillat in her honor, given by the wonderful publication Plough Quarterly. I want to say that I'm fortunate to have met Rhina Espaillat several times in real life, and I can say that she is as beautiful a person as she is a poet. And I recall how I felt myself bloom under her beneficent warmth, really a living sun. The poem I'll be reading for you this evening brings us from warmth to dismal cold, from beneficence to cruelty. My poem, The Hunger Winter, looks at a detail from a lesser-known horror of the Second World War, a famine that afflicted the Western Netherlands, a famine in which 20,000 people are estimated to have perished. We don't think of famines afflicting wealthy Western nations, let alone agricultural powers like the Netherlands. And indeed, this was an engineered famine created by a retaliatory embargo on food and fuel by the Nazis who occupied the country. The famine lasted from November 1944, pretty much until liberation in May of 1945. And worse, the suffering was exacerbated by an exceptionally cold winter. And because this famine took place in a wealthy Western nation, it provided one of the foundations of epigenetics, which is basically the study of changes to our genes due to external causes. As the children of women who were pregnant during the famine were studied and found to carry physical marks of the suffering, yet 6 decades later. In all kinds of ways, the Second World War is still very present in the Netherlands, and in others, it is miraculously invisible. In my poem, The Objects of Contemplation are some trees which were cut for fuel, which was an illegal act. People also burned their furniture and other things as people struggled to keep warm. And now I'm going to read the poem. The Hunger Winter, the Netherlands, 1944 to 1945. Prologue. A dark dictated famine made by war. Small fires for warmth lit up the towns. Canals blockaded by command froze up, as if to make a point. The Dutch began to starve. They gnawed on sugar beets and tulip bulbs. Out walking here in Naarden's ancient woods, I see a stand of trees made strange by war. Bullets have signed the bark, their wounds a mad and modern furioso. No Arden here. And in the rows of trees, a few grow straight, but only for a foot or two, then veer off east or west, continuing to rise within a different column of air, as if an origami fold had given them a surreal twist. These trees were cut for fuel, but over 7 decades grew again. Time is simple for a tree. It hides its rings inside, a strange geometry by which a rise inscribes itself as round. The reckoning of feet or yards remains visible, as though the tree might be a giant wooden ruler marking years. These limping trees look frightened, almost as if, having seen something terrible, they tried to take a step. They tried to walk or run. 3/4 of a century is long, even if less long for trees, which hold their winters close and imperceptibly rise. They will never grow straight now, yet they grow.
Thank you, Susan. Rhina?
The last 3 words are magical because they carry the weight of all the rest of the poem, yet they grow. And that's to weigh 3 words against a rather lengthy poem like this one is very daring, but it works. Because what you say is that which is going to live despite everything. And I love the touch, the drop of hope at the end that is so effective. I like the idea that the trees tried to walk or maybe even run. They were that desperate to live. Of course, they couldn't do that, but they're going to survive anyway. I like the fact that the word tree is hidden in the word geometry. I like the fact that, that it's origami that makes them look surreal, because that's playful. But how can you be playful about a disaster like this that happens in war? Well, you can. If you're hopeful, if you're a poet, if you believe in the strength of the will to live and the desire of everything living to continue, then you can. You can be playful about anything, even while you're busy crying. I like the fact that the trees limp as if they were frightened. I like the fact that, they have modern furioso. There's something operatic about that. There is something operatic about every tragedy, and it's almost humor, but not quite. In fact, I like everything about this, and yet the detail at the fifth line of the entry to the poem, they gnawed on sugar beets and tulip bulbs. The things that have made the Dutch famous throughout the world is their marvelous flowers. But here they are, and when you have to eat something, you have to eat it. It's as if the poem were saying, whatever is good for this will be good for that as well. You make do with what you have. The bullets have signed the bark, as if the bullets too were alive, as if the bullets too were tools for memory, for remembering, because everything is. That's what history is. It's a wonderful poem, a wonderful poem. It works, and it awakens all of us who read to the necessity to do things differently in the future.
And I would just add one comment. I mean, this poem is so well crafted that one of the most important things about it, I didn't notice on a first read. I had to notice on the second read, which is that it's written in blank verse. And it's a really good choice. Contemporary, more contemporary, but like Howard Nemeroff and Robert Frost, when telling this type of complex story, have generally shied away from rhyme but have also shied away from free verse, because there's sort of a stateliness to blank verse, you know, that from Milton and Shakespeare and whatnot, that even if you're not focused on the craft of poetry, you can hear it in the rhythm. It gives it a solemnity, and particularly given the subject matter of this poem, it was a very wise choice in terms of craft. I read a certain number of poems where, you know, some of those decisions weren't so good, but this is one, particularly when I read it the second time, and I read it a number of times, all of a sudden it hit me that it's how extreme. I mean, I liked the poem right from the beginning, but I missed some of it the first time around. And the second time around, I really came to respect the craft of the poem. And I think it's another very good choice by the editorial board of Plough. It's a very nice, very well done poem.
I'd like to add a personal touch, which is the fact that I grew up during the 1930s in New York. Just when people were pouring in from different parts of Europe to get away from this, or other versions of this in different countries. So I feel this in a way that I don't feel many things that happen in history today, because I heard those children who were my age talk about the people they had left behind, who they knew they would never see again. And I remember their hunger as if I had gone through it, and their fear of death as if I had gone through it. So it's a poem that is all about memory, whether it's your own or somebody else's.
Thank you. So, we'll move on now to the final poem and the winner. I think one of the things that was a very pleasant surprise for Plough, which the journal, I think, takes great pride in being international and having international affiliates that work with it, that two of the three winning poets came from overseas. Yeah. I'm tempted to try to take credit for that in some way, but I really can't. I love this poem right from the beginning. It really did knock my socks off. I have to be careful here because I might betray my geography and sports affiliation by mispronouncing the title. So I've had to make a little mental note, you know, to get it right. But Mari Owens from Scotland has won with a poem called For the Celts. And Mari, I wonder if you could do us the honor of reading your wonderful poem.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy that this poem's found a home in New York. It was written in response to that footage that I'm sure a lot of people saw of the mass COVID burials in Hart Island. For the Celts, Hart Island, New York, April 2020. To whom it may concern, leave them their rings, those sentimental claddas pledging love, friendship and loyalty, enduring things that might scorch ash in a nameless, kinless grave. Those daytime drones will pass overhead. Then from night's watchful edifice a quill may rain, not on the deceased, but on the dead. If only there should lie a poet whose words prevail. But no, for those remotely Celtic, for the throng of voiceless, faceless, buried without coins for passage, but with proffered hearts, dark song will come. Then pray the Celtic forgotten scream might raise them and unleash their shimmering green dancers to fair leash.
Thank you, Mari. Rhina.
I had to look up a great many words here, and I'm grateful for every one of them. I would love to hear you say some of those again. For example, the one in the third line from the bottom is a beautiful, beautiful phrase, and I can't possibly say it. Is it kayak oitke ban?
Kayak
oitke ban. It's beautiful. I loved the sound of overseas, the sound of another culture that is not mine, which is expressing the same kind of horror that I would feel leaving someone of mine without the coin, without the name, without the memory, without the kinfolk around. So it's universal. It's universal in so many ways because of the use of the language that nobody will pronounce the way you do. Because of the names of things, because of the fact that the rings are designed as pledging love, friendship, and loyalty, enduring things. So you've brought the outside world to this one, and I'm grateful for that because the more of that we get, the better off we are. I think we need it all desperately right now. I love the nameless, kinless grave, which is something very common in dictatorships like the one in which I was born, where a great many people lie in nameless, kinless graves. The remotely Celtic, the throng of voiceless, faceless, buried without coins. That's a wonderful line. It brings to mind all the feelings that you are not putting into other words, that you are not using the word love, or the word heartbreak, or the word solitude, or the word, so many words you could have used that would have been less useful than these. Thank you for a really perfect poem.
Yeah, I as I said, this one knocked my socks off from the beginning. And it's, and one of the interesting things about this whole mission was trying to figure out, well, how do you go about deciding what should the standards be and that kind of thing. And we didn't give the poets too much guidance except to say, well, we really would like to see things in the spirit of Rhina Espaillat, which is not very limiting in certain ways, given her breadth. But this one I read, and boy, my first reaction, boy, this feels like Rhina in some key respects in a lot of ways, and certainly the bilingual nature of the poem, and not and for real purpose too, to really make you feel the sadness of the geography. I was jealous in a way because there's a comparable island in Boston Harbor where I think there are about 10,000 unmarked Irish graves where they just didn't make it at all, died en route, and were buried on this particular island in Boston Harbor. And I've tried to figure out how to express that in a poem and failed. And so when you see somebody doing something comparable and so so beautifully. You can't help but being a little jealous. So you certainly have my admiration. And it felt very much like Rhina's work too, in that it's very respectful of the sonnet frame, but not a slave to it. And they're the natural speech rhythms that control the poem, not phrasing that's forced from the form. So it's a lovely, moving, extremely well executed poem. And I'm grateful that you submitted it. I'm grateful that all three of you submitted these poems. And I hope that we'll be blessed if we get poems of comparable quality next year and in the out years, because you've done just a marvelous job of setting a standard for the people that are going to participate in future years.
Thanks so much for making year one memorable.
So before I chat with Rhina a little bit, do any of the poets have anything you want to say? We've been kind of controlling the platform here. Is there anything that you'd like to add that you haven't had a chance to say so far? No? Okay, good. All right, Rhina. So we could do this a couple ways. Would you like to maybe just kick off by reading us a poem, or?
Sure, why not?
Okay.
I'd like to read a poem that in its own way is about, well, I don't know how to call it, hope accepted maybe. I'm a great believer in hope, not because it promises anything or because it's always going to work and bring you what you hoped for, but because it's so on the right side of things. It is so on the side that says, let's think positive. Let's bring our own best and hope that whatever the life force is, it will bring what's best with it. This is called The Bargain. This is from a book of mine called And After All, which follows a series of very painful deaths in my family, among friends, among people that I love very much, ending with the death of my husband 4 years ago. And the feeling that I had of never being able to love life as much before as I used to. But of course, that's not the right way to look to things, because you do have to think not of what you've lost, but of what you were lucky to have before you lost it. Because that's also true. That's also reality. And this is called The Bargain. And the person with whom I'm having this imaginary conversation is time, because I talk to everything. You know how poets are. The Bargain. As if ashamed, time said, I'll tell you what, I can't give anything back, but how about I teach you how to almost do without the goods I've repossessed so far. How's that? Well, aren't you all heart, I said. One hand makes off with the silverware, and then the other opens to lend me back again one plastic teaspoon. I don't understand. I'm not such a bad sort, time said. You'll see. But this last offer won't be good forever. There's so much to reclaim. More bonds to sever, lights to put out, and speech and memory. Trinkets you'll need before I strip you naked. Do reconsider. And I said, I'll take it.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So much for hope.
Yeah. So presumably we have got poets watching who are have already submitted for this year, are eagerly working on their submissions. And particularly, I guess for the, I won't say younger, because a lot of us got started seriously in poetry later in life, but for newer poets, do you have any kind of advice as to when you're really trying to up your game and try to participate in something like this, what they ought to be thinking about?
I think if you start thinking about concrete things, it's very hard to get someplace because you're looking with a purpose. And if you're trying to write poetry, a purpose is not a good way to do it. It's good to observe. What you need is accident. Almost all of my poems come out of accident. I happen to be looking there rather than here. And there, a bird is doing something interesting. And I don't know what's doing there, but I can only look at one place at one time. So the advice from me is to look, to listen, to feel, to touch, taste things, smell things. Let the senses lead you wherever they want to, and let experience make its mark on you. It's experience that I write from. Other people may write out of ideas, out of a desire to make something happen that seems important to you, but that hasn't happened yet. But what I do is watch what is going on. And what happens is that eventually, if I look long enough, some of it, something about it, seems new, seems fresh, and seems significant. And before I know it, I've got a poem. And once I've got a poem, I've got something else that I'm thinking about. And it kind of weaves itself into a poem. And I listen very carefully, because I never, ever tell the poem what to do, because my experience has been that the poems are invariably smarter than I am. So I just let them talk to me and say whatever they want. And once I'm sure I understand what they're trying to say, then I put down the first draft. And after that, the critic moves in. And the critic, who is a pain in the neck, begins to fight. And he wants to change this, he wants to change that, and he wants to change the other. And I want to throw him out, but I can't. But he turns out to be right about one thing or another. So we work it between us. We kind of make bargains between us. And that's how the poem comes about. And then I let other people give me advice. And I either listen or I don't.
One of the things I thought was interesting, I've read a ton of poems in the last 20 years or so in different capacities. I was the first moderator on the first big poetry site on the internet and read a ton of poems there. And I've judged contests and I've taught at conferences and one painful year at Emerson College and, and that kind of thing. And I was struck a little bit this year by, it was kind of a different texture in certain ways of the poems. There were, and I think I'm going to blame social media on this. There were a lot more poems than I'm used to seeing that felt like opinion pieces, op-eds that were sort of forced into some form of poetry, from generally free verse, but sometimes into restricted forms. And I felt badly for a lot of the poets because they had things that they felt that were important that they wanted to say. But those poems really didn't succeed very much at all. I mean, they really did read like op-ed pieces that were out of context. In that, what you really need to try to do is what these three poets have done for us today, and what Rhina has done, you know, for so long, for so many of us, is find the images that just naturally speak to what it is that you want to say, instead of sort of wagging your finger and saying, this is what you ought to believe. And I was very struck by the number of this is what you ought to believe poems that I read this year. So for those of you who are listening in thinking, whether it's the competition or just your poetry generally, you know, when this issue comes out, you should definitely read it. Look at these poems. And as I've said about them, look at the ways that the nouns and the verbs speak so clearly without very much modification. And then the modifications in terms of adverbs and adjectives are really there for purpose, that they really add something, you know, important to the content of the poem that you can't use, that you can't say with just a noun or verb. So I would say a little bit more attention to craft, I think is going to be important for successful poems. And again, it's wonderful to be all fired up by things. And I wrote some terrible poems like that when I was first writing poetry too.
You wouldn't know how to write a terrible poem if you took lessons.
No, believe me, you never saw them. Before I met you, I wrote some pretty terrible poems. And that's really the trick. And that's when you look at people that are masters of poetry, like these three winners today and the winner to my left, and and the winner across here who did all the IT work, Alfred Nicole, who's getting no other credit for helping us put this together today. I think that's really, I mean, if you're looking to succeed, whether it's win a contest or to get published or simply to read the kind of poems, to have the kind of poems that when you read for an audience, you know, you're going to get that little hum at the end. You're going to get that little nodding, and you get that connection with an audience, which we're missing, you know, in this time period. That may also be, you know, part of the problem is that you can't field test your poetry the same way that we've been able to do historically. But
Mike, can I ask you a question about that? Because it seems to me you have a very interesting sort of window, having read, you know, all of these many submissions. I don't want to ask if there was a particular subject, but I am curious to know if there was a particular tone that stood out. Was it an angry tone or a sad tone or a grieving tone?
It was anger, and I think it's the political climate. I think it's the pandemic, and I think it's social media too. I overtweet. I probably do more tweeting about formal poetry than anybody on my Twitter site. And so, and I've been on, I think, 7 years, and I read a lot of poetry there too, in order to find the small number of things that I think are going to interest my idiosyncratic audience. And I think I'm seeing the same thing on social media, that there's less attention to craft and more attention to message, and in a hurry to get that message across in kind of a bald way. I think I have some suspicion that perhaps some of the MFA programs may be encouraging this a little bit, because it's not necessarily, you know, the people that are amateurs at this, and not, I don't use amateur in a negative way. I used to describe myself for a long time in the poetry world as a dangerous amateur. But I think there is sort of an ethic all of a sudden that who you are and what you have to say is what's most important, and that the craft aspect of it really doesn't matter very much. And I think that's a mistake. You know, this year, all 3 of these poems had a significant formal element. But if you looked at I think it was 19 that I took to the editorial board, probably about half had a formal element and half were in free verse. And it's important, if you're writing in free verse, to write with careful craft as well. And I think too many people are trying to go directly from getting their feelings out on bottling them and putting them on the page. And because they have such a strong belief in the opinions that are driving them to put it on the page, they think that that is going to work with other people, when in fact, when you're editorializing that way, you've got all this background that's driving your thought that you know. And what I say sometimes in the workshop that I've been in with Rhina for 25 years, what I often say is the poem in your head is different from the poem on the page.
You bet.
And I think that, you know, this year it looked to me like there was a bigger gap between the poem in the head and the poem on the page than what I'd seen, you know, tended to see in previous years.
You know, what I think Mike is talking about is about the difference between the how and the what. Every poem has a what. It has to have something, it's talking about something. But it also has a how, and the how is every bit as important as the what, and it has to come first. The same way you have to get through the basement stairs in order to get downstairs. You can't fly down. You can't throw yourself out the first floor window to get down there. There has to be a route from one thing to the other. The route is the how. The route is the craft, is what you do to nudge the reader into the room you're in and say to him, look, here's what I see. Here's what I'm in the middle of. Look out the window with me. The reader has to come into the room with you before he sees anything that you're trying to explain to him is there. The what you don't have to worry about, because life gives you the what, whether you want it or not. A great deal of the what that I have written about, I don't want at all. It's about the death of people I love. It's about the absence of family. It's about losses of all kinds, but it's there. And even if I wanted to get rid of it, I couldn't. And I don't want to anyway, because I want memory to hold on to those things. But the thing that is fun to do, the thing that is creative, and that gives me a kind of outlet so that the grief has a way to get out, is the how. And the how is all that we can learn in life if we're writers. And the how is the way the carpenter uses the wood and the tools that he's got. We all have the wood. If we learn and we read enough poetry, we find the tools because they've been used for millennia. You find them and you learn how to use them. That's the how. That's important. That's all that your life will give you beside the experience. And the experience you can't do one thing about. So just take
Rhina, can I ask you a question about that? I mean, you've been writing poetry, for a very long time.
Since I was curious, a week or two ago.
Yeah. But I mean, it really gives you, I think, a very wonderful perspective, especially because a lot of poets, well, at least canonically, sort of stop writing at a certain moment, or they feel that they're finished, or very, very complex bundles of things. But really, what my question is more about, if you can tell us anything about, after this lifetime of poetry, was there a moment where you felt like you had reached a plateau and that you had all the tools in your belt? Or does writing a poem last week feel again like a new discovery versus writing a poem 20 years ago? I mean, how is it actually to write poems, with so many decades of experience?
Well, I wish that I had learned more along the way than I have learned, because you never learn enough. There's no such thing as enough. There are always things you're doing wrong that you read afterwards. A few weeks, you put the poem aside, and then you look at it again and you say, what was I thinking? So you can always learn more. There are always more tools than you've really got a handle on. So there's that. And there's also experience without end. There are so many things that have happened. I hear about the lives of other people, for instance, the lives of people in a country like Holland, or like the Netherlands, which are being starved in order to lose a war. Somebody wants them to starve in order to lose a war. How do you survive that? How do you think your way through that? How do you justify that? How do you forgive that? So there are always experiences, whether they're your own or other people's, mostly other people's. I've heard so many stories about people who have hidden during the 1940s, for instance, in France, in Germany, in Poland. My friend in Poland, who spent several weeks hiding every night under haystacks, because the Italian army would permit the Jews to hide under haystacks, and they would bring them food and water, so long as the army didn't know what they were up to, because they were soldiers and they were supposed to be on the other side. But they were decent enough to want these civilians to survive. So they did that. How, unless you yourself have lived through something like that, how do you say, I'm through writing, I have nothing else to say? It's impossible to do that. Even if the experience is not yours, if it's somebody's experience that you loved, whose life you value and valued, because I've lost a great many of those people that I went to school with and that I grew up with and brought up children with and so on. You can't let those experiences go just because you're somebody else. I think that one of the things that poetry does better than anything else is to allow us to trade lives, allow us to trade our own experiences with those of other people, experiences that we're never going to be able to trade, allow us to travel backward in time to what other people lived that we've never known. I've never really known poverty like my mother's. I never have. But I can imagine it because I've heard the stories. And if you have read the stories from other poets of what other lives were like, then you have in a way borrowed those lives. And I don't believe that it's a terrible thing to, what's the word they say when you
Appropriation.
Appropriation. People talk about appropriation as if it were a bad thing. You're stealing my life. No, you're not stealing my life. If you're interested enough in what I've been through to think about it, to imagine yourself in my shoes, to write a poem about it, you're not appropriating it. You're giving me the gift of your attention, the gift of your affection. So appropriate all you want by all means. I think that that's one of the things that poetry is good for. Nothing else is that good. So there's always, always, always more to do, more to write about, more to think about, more to feel about. Because if anything is going wrong now, it's the fact that we're not feeling enough.
So we're starting to head to wrapping up, but before we do, I want to introduce a mischievous note and ask Maury, now that she's a very rich poet, has she given any thought to what she would like to do with her winnings?
That's a bit of a sneaky trick question. So given the subject of my poem, when I wrote the poem, I was just lucky enough. One of the silver linings of lockdown for me was everybody getting on Zoom and being able to reconnect with my group of writers I started with in Glasgow, which is on the other side, the other coast of Scotland from me. So I wrote the poem really for that group, you know, not for this competition, but when I found out more about Rhina and was reading her poetry, I thought it fits really well with you know, Rhina's approach and stuff. So, I'd read a bit more after writing the poem about the Heart Island project. And so I thought, you know, there's loads of people looking to access Heart Island, and it's a bunch of volunteers, lawyers and so on, helping people access Heart Island. There's a lot of people buried there, relatives looking for them. And so I've donated the money to the Heart Island project, and I would encourage anyone else who can help them in any way to do that.
Well, that is a wonderful thing, and I think something that helps get this first Espaillat Award off to just a really tremendous start. So you're a great example, and thank you for that. Yes. I think on that note, anything else that you want to say?
Well, I just want to say to everybody, keep writing, because you are giving us all a gift, and we need it.
And I will say, I've been with Plough for 1.5 years, and I was not terribly familiar with it before. Initially, wasn't interested in signing up for working on another journal, but it really has been magnificent. Yes. I have enjoyed every moment of designing this award and then executing it. And then tonight, it's really been an honor. And I do think if you're out there and you haven't not only read the journal, but they've got a very fine website, and there's poetry on the website. There's a book publishing arm of Plough that does do some poetry and writing about poetry. And if you're in the New York area, there are also events that that Plough runs there, and I think in other locations as well. So, you know, get online, make sure you check out the website, you know, check out the journal, and there's a lot of poetry coming through. We've had some great poets in the journal in recent issues. We've had Rachel Haddis and Christian Wyman and some of the really, really top poets. So check out Plough a little bit more broadly. Keep sending in the poems for next year's award, and hope to see you next year for an event very much like this one. Mm-hmm. So again, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to all the folks at Plough who worked very hard to put this event together. Thank you, Peter Monson. Yes, Peter and Sam and everybody, yes. Just great job. So I think with that, we will bring it to a close. Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. It's really a delight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Hope to see you all in person someday.
Likewise.
Oh, that was great. Fun.